Even though life is all related due to a shared common ancestry, only members of the same species can sexually reproduce and have offspring. A species is defined as a group of individual organisms that are reproductively isolated from other groups of organisms and can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. I emphasize three components to this definition because even amongst biologists, this is not a clear cut definition. I'll provide examples why later, but note the following. To be reproductively isolated means that two individuals of different species cannot successfully make offspring with one another. Means of reproductive isolation can range from two organisms being separated geographically, like African Asian elephants, to as small as mismatched chromosomes during zygote development. These breedings must be natural and not interfered by human involvement. Technically, dogs evolved from wolves and can still interbreed with each other. But because dogs are an example of artificial selection, that is, selection based on the preferences of human, they are not considered a natural species. Therefore, dogs and wolves can hybridize, but only because humans make this occur. And even though dogs are so varied in their appearance, all dogs are members of the same species. Finally, the two species must produce fertile offspring, that is, the offspring that can also reproduce. Hybrid individuals of two species do exist, such as American bald eagles and African fish eagles, but oftentimes they are either reproductively sterile or they make offspring that are reproductively sterile. Not only that, they are naturally separated on two continents, so they wouldn't even meet to breed anyway. Speciation is the formation of two species from one original species. This was envisioned by Darwin as a branching pattern drawn in the Origin of Species concerning elephants. Today, only two elephant species currently exist, but there were many found throughout ancient history. Here we see that African and Asian elephants share ancestry but are now considered separate species. For speciation to occur, they must prevent two populations from interacting with each other. These mechanisms fall into two categories: allopatric speciation, which results in the separation of a parent species by geographic separation, which is the case of Asian and African elephants, being thousands of miles apart, and also sympatric speciation. These involve mechanisms that separate from a parent species within the same geographic location. Blue crabs and ghost crabs live in the same geographic area, United States and Canadian Atlantic shorelines, but develop mechanisms to become separate species. The first step in speciation is to cut off any gene flow between populations. Gene flow is the movement of genes from one population to another. Once gene flow stops, species could evolve along different trajectories. Allopatric speciation makes this process easier by physically separating populations by geographical location. This can be as dramatic as seeds blowing from mainland to a newly formed island to as small as a river forming a new branch. Separating populations between flying organisms or those with easier means of dispersal, like birds and flying insects, makes it more difficult, but smaller, less modal species such as ferns and salamanders make speciation more likely. Biologists divide allopatric speciation into two categories: dispersal, in which a few members of a population leave and form a new population in a different geographical area. Many island species form this way. For example, this single bird species has a variety of feather colors and sizes, but a group of smaller pink-colored birds left and formed a new population on the island 1,000 miles away. The genes carried by this group could determine the future of this species. Vicariance, in which a natural event physically divides populations of organisms. Salamanders are limited to a small space for life. In West Virginia, there are two species of two-lined salamanders, northern and southern two-lined salamanders. But because of the New and the Kanawha rivers, these two species do not naturally interact and interbreed because the populations that border the river can't cross to meet. Changes in the environment causes changes in niches and habitats. When these changes are sudden, it's possible that a population of ancestral species can speciate quickly. This is called adaptive radiation. This concept has been well studied with the Hawaiian Islands, as they were formed a few million years ago. Each island is separated, making geographic isolation possible. When ancestral honey creepers arrived by dispersal from mainland North America and the island was ripe with new niches and habitats, it followed for adaptive radiation to occur. Today, there are over 25 species across the islands. each with varying beak shapes that coincide with their diet. Think of adaptive radiation using the metaphor of the rise of the internet. Experts suggested by 1996 that was the pivotal year that the internet took off in the United States. Before that, the internet was popular. You would do shopping in stores. Communication was done via phone or letters. You got your TV by antenna, cable, and satellite. Music was put on cassettes and CDs, and many services still required humans. Afterwards, these services shifted in this direction. Shopping became online, communication through email, social media, texting, TV is streamed through services, music is downloadable and streamed, and many of these services are now automated. Notice that the old ways are still there. You still shop in stores, some people still have cable, and still some people like to listen to vinyl records. But they never, but they are phasing away, and the newer ways are taking over. Evolution works in a similar fashion. It's not abrupt, but a series of small changes over time. For many species, they live in the same geographic area, so how did their populations become separated as to stop gene flow? This requires that two populations become reproductively isolated from one another. There are two categories of reproductive isolation. Pre-zygotic barriers are those that prevent a zygote or fertilized egg from being formed. Most reproductive isolation mechanisms work this way. For example, green and bullfrogs live in similar habitats, but their mating calls prevent attraction of the opposite species from mating with each other. Post-zygotic barriers are those mechanisms that either destroy embryos or make offspring reproductively sterile. Ligers are a cross between tigers and lions. They can't make offspring as a result. And yes, if you are wondering, that is one of Doc Antle's ligers from Tiger King, that creep. Let's go through the different types of barriers in place that maintain reproductive isolation of species living in the same geographic area. The simplest form of pre-zygotic barriers are those that prevent any contact between species living in the same geographic area. Ecological or habitat isolation is reproductive isolation achieved by living in non-overlapping habitats. In the eastern United States, gray squirrels and fox squirrels live in different habitats and rarely come across one another. Gray squirrels like dense woodlands and more urban habitats, while fox squirrels like more open woodlands, agricultural fields, and rural areas. Flowering dogwood and silky dogwood are also native to the eastern United States and are prized as ornamental trees worldwide. They remain separate species because flowering dogwood inhabits more drier areas while silky dogwood inhabits wetlands. Even if two species live in the same habitat, they may have different breeding seasons or they flower at different times of the year. Most organisms have timed reproductive schedules, often just annually. Humans are an exception of an organism with no breeding season. Here are two salamander species of the same genus and even live in the same habitat, temporary wetlands. You can even find both species residing there at the same time. But spotted salamanders breed in early spring, while marbled salamanders breed in the fall. Life is weird. So if two species live in the same habitat and have the same mating season, how do they remain separate species? This requires behavioral isolation. Take birds of paradise in New Guinea. These colorful males have specific patterns used to attract females of the same species. Coupled with that is a unique courtship dance only appreciated by females of that species. Male giraffes have to taste the urine of a female he likes and then fight off other males by necking, where they hit each other with the necks to assert dominance. Look, everyone has their kinks. I ask you not to shame them. The point is, when species have similar mating seasons, the presence or absence of specific behaviors will help with reproductive isolation. So if two species are attracted by the behaviors of different species, how is reproductive isolation achieved? Mechanical isolation. If the reproductive parts are incompatible, a successful mating can't happen as shown with the copulatory organs of these damselflies. And since most flowers rely on animal pollinators for mating, many have co-evolved with the pollinator's body shape and mouth parts to help with the process. Therefore, these two plants can't be pollinated by the other pollinator species. Even if organisms can successfully mate, don't forget that all organisms possess a unique set of chromosomes that are only compatible with the same species. Here's a comparison to chromosomes 7 through 12 amongst humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. Though we share ancestry, our chromosomes are different enough to prevent a successful offspring. What if two species live in the same geographic location, occupy the same habitat in active periods, have similar breeding seasons, are attracted to one another, are able to successfully mate, and actually make a baby? When all pre-zygotic barriers are exhausted, then there are two post-zygotic barriers. One is embryo failure, and the other is achieved through hybrid infertility, meaning that the hybrid made by two species is unable to reproduce. If it does, then their offspring are unable to reproduce. Take a male horse and a female donkey. They can make a mule, which is an infertile hybrid. Polyploidy occurs when an organism inherits extra sets of chromosomes. For example, if an organism has 20 chromosomes, they could inherit 40, which would be 2 sets, or 60, which would be 3 sets. Autopolyploidy is polyploidy that happens within a species of an organism. This results in diploid parent cells that undergo mitosis but not cytokinesis. For example, if a plant were to inherit 2 sets of chromosomes, it would be incompatible with the original parent species with regular euploid or normal set of chromosomes. In other words, the diploid parent that results in making polyploid offspring would result in 4N offspring, only making offspring with other 4N offspring. Generally, autopolyploid organisms can only self-fertilize unless other individuals in a population are also autopolyploid with the same number of chromosomes. Another form of polyploidy is when 2 different species produce a viable offspring. This is called allopolyploidy. Say the species A and B are both diploid and mate, but their offspring is polyploid. This becomes a new species because it can't breed with the parent species due to the incompatibility of chromosome numbers. Polyploidy is rare in animals, often leading to death of zygotes and embryos, but is found some in nature as a plant adaptation and seen commonly in many agricultural crops. That's because polyploid plants tend to have more robust anatomical features, which are attractive when you're trying to sell fruits and vegetables. So speciation takes a long time. So what happens during this transition period between closely related species that are sympatric to each other? These hybrid zones can form where 2 species ranges, habitats, mating patterns, etc. overlap. American and Fowler's toads both live in the same habitat and geographic range, and to the untrained eye look the same. The reason they are separate species is due to the slight differences in calls, but mostly different mating seasons. With human-caused climate change happening, hybrids are forming between 2 species due to sudden shifts in seasonal weather. Hybrid zones could cause a reconnection of 2 species in transition, but there are 3 outcomes that could occur. Reinforcements first, so if a hybrid occurs, it is less fit than either parent and therefore will not produce as many viable offspring as either parent. Hybrids will then just slowly die out. Fusion occurs when reproductive barriers are weakening, causing the 2 species to become one again. And then finally, stability is where hybrids continue to form amongst the 2 separate species and have similar fitness to either parent. Due to climate change, this mechanism is likely to happen as there is no selective advantage to being either species of toad or the hybrid. However, we can begin to question if there really is only one species of toad in this scenario. Thus far, there are 2 patterns of speciation that exist in nature based on current species and fossil record. Gradualism is the model first adopted by Darwin and makes the most sense when studying evolution. In it, species diverge from an ancestor in small steps over time. However, evidence has shown that, especially with adaptive radiation, that punctuated equilibrium could also occur. In this, a species diverges from an ancestor, followed by sudden changes, followed by little to any changes over a long period of time. Keep in mind, both forms are gradualistic, it's just that punctuated suggests that changes move faster over time. It's important to remember that the evolution of species first begins at the level of population. Up next, we will see the mechanisms involved to begin the process of evolution that eventually leads one species to become 2.